you want to talk first up about land rights, and you've obviously got a special guest you want to speak to first of all tonight.
Before we do that, let's ask everyone listening in, how would you like it if you were renting a house and paying rent, or you were paying off a house and had a mortgage on it, and the government came along and took your kitchen and took one of the bedrooms and said you're charging the same rent, same mortgage, but you can't use those 2 rooms ever again? Then a couple of years later, it came along and took a second bedroom, took the living room and maybe the garage, and said, tough, you can't use them. You think that's fair? When someone buys land, or a house on land or a property, they own the rights to use that for their productive purposes. That's it, nothing else. They own the rights to use their land. But farmers know, coastal residents know, and some urban dwellers are increasingly finding out they don't control their land. They can't use their land. And we've got someone on the line here, Dan McDonald, who's a farmer from Charleville. And I'll just read this to make sure I get it all right. I visited him a number of times. Look, he's a really genuine, down-to-earth person. Very, very competent, highly intelligent, skilled, and dedicated. And the law says he has a right to use his property. He bought this property at Charleville on the basis that he could, in times of drought, feed the mulga to the cattle. They love it. But the state government told him that they couldn't do it. So, Dan, are you there? G'day, mate. How are you?
No, we've lost Dan at the moment. We'll probably have to bring him in on this. Have we got you there, Dan? We'll get him on another line. It's I've been out with you and Pauline to Dan's property.
Yeah.
And it's tragic to think that he's just been restricted, and he's got plenty of feed there for his cattle, particularly during these dry periods. He's unable to use it properly.
And a lot of that grassland, a lot of that area out there was once grassland, and since European settlement, it's become mulga land, and it's now become sterilised because of that. You know, it goes back in 1996 to the UN's Kyoto Protocol. Now, that mightn't mean much to most people, but what it means was that our government, under John Howard as Prime Minister, said that while we wouldn't sign the Kyoto Protocol, we would comply with it. Now, he wasn't going to stop industry because he knew the Australian people would boot him out. So what he did was something very, very crafty and cunning, and I think his government was deceitful. Because what they did was they said to the UN, we will stop the clearing of land to get credits for the clearing of that land against our carbon credits. And so they stopped farmers clearing land, and they did a deal with the Borbidge National Party government and then the Beattie Labor government, and since then the state land protection legislation has got tighter and tighter and tighter, and now chokes farmers' use of land. And that's what Dan's about. He's been convicted of clearing land to feed his cattle during a drought. That's the reason he bought that land. So Dan, can you tell us more, please, mate?
G'day, Malcolm. Yes, so Malcolm, about 2006, myself and my wife purchased this property. We purchased a grazing property for the purpose of running our livestock business, and of course in that, the most valuable element of property you're buying, one would normally think, is obviously the vegetation to feed the cattle, but probably primarily more important than the vegetation itself is that we actually needed to buy the right to use the vegetation. So essentially, Malcolm, that's what we set about doing. We purchased this property in fee simple, and we actually purchased it from the state of Queensland. So so we bought this vegetation from the state of Queensland in 2006, and for the purpose of running our grazing business. It is grazing land, classified as grazing land. And of course, since then, over the last 5 years, I've been prosecuted by the state of Queensland for using that vegetation, prosecuted as a criminal, and essentially I do not have the right to use that vegetation. The state of Queensland now assert that they hold the right, they hold that property to use my vegetation, my land, for their own purposes, that being conservation and carbon sequestration.
So they took the right to use that land off you, and under Section 51, Clause 31 of the Constitution, it says, the acquisition of property on just terms from any state or person for any purpose in respect of which the Parliament has power to make laws. Did they compensate you?
No, absolutely not. No.
So they stole
Not-
the land.
Exactly. They've stolen it. Not only did they not compensate me, they didn't even comply with the principles of property law that we have in Queensland, and register or retain the vegetation as an interest in their right. So it's an extremely interesting situation, Malcolm, because as I said, the most valuable element of property we buy in a grazing business is not just the vegetation, it's the right to use it. So it's like when someone buys a home in the city, let's say, whilst you might look at a lovely tangible piece of property there, beautiful looking home, the most valuable element you're buying there is the right to live in that home. Without that, doesn't matter how good the property is, without that right to occupy that home, essentially it's worthless. And what we've got in this situation is a case where we've bought property and now that valuable element, that right of use, has been taken from us.
And it gets worse than that, because there are so many restrictions being put on farmers today that are driven by bureaucrats who are actually going against the environmental science, correct?
No, that's right, absolutely. The overall outcome made in this part of the world is totally negative. They're actually harming the environment by what they're doing. So there's really no good part of it. You made reference there earlier, Malcolm, to the Constitution, the Federal Constitution, and of course that's obviously the most powerful piece of law that we're all meant to abide by. But of course, even in state legislation, the state themselves were obligated under their own statute book to compensate me for taking that property, and of course, they've refused to do so. Made no attempt whatsoever.
And they've got guidelines for making legislation, haven't they, Dan? And they've broken their own laws and regulations around those guidelines.
That's right, Malcolm. We've got in Queensland, we've got the Legislative Standards Act, and Section 4 of the Legislative Standards Act essentially underpins the Constitution, and it sets out the rules effectively for Parliament when they go to make laws. And of course, in that it says that if they are going to acquire property in making a law, they can only do so with fair and just compensation. But of course, they don't comply with their own law, mate. So
you're a farm owner, so you actually are a food producer. What does this do to the price of food for people in the city?
Well, it can only push it up. Long term, it will only ever push prices up. The consumer will pay more. There's no doubt about that, because we're having massive tracts of farmland now converted into national parks. Essentially, we're just unpaid national park rangers on our own land. And of course, whenever you restrict supply, it's like anything, Malcolm, supply and demand. Whenever you restrict supply, you're going to see the prices go up. So. And
you've also got land being dedicated to carbon farming, which taxpayers are paying money to the government to actually buy this farmland, productive land, and it's now turned into wasteland full of noxious weeds and feral animals, which the neighbours have to take care of. So the state government is just paying to ruin land, this federal government is paying to ruin this land, and then the farmers have to pay for those costs to manage that land for them.
Well, that's right, and probably the most stupid part of all of that, Malcolm, is the simple fact that our land sequesters carbon no matter what. And as a farmer, no matter what you do, as a farmer, your sole business principle is sequestration of carbon. Everything you create is made of carbon dioxide converted into carbon. So, without carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we're out of business. And effectively, everything we do is, for that matter, sequestering carbon. So we've got government on one hand, we've got government paying people to sequester carbon under the Carbon Farming Initiative by locking up vegetation, not growing food, which would be sequestering the carbon anyway, indeed more than what the vegetation that they're locking up does. The other element of that, Malcolm, is that in a state like Queensland, for example, about 65% of the land mass of Queensland is state-owned land, okay? So all the vegetation on 65% of Queensland is owned by the people of Queensland, okay? And we've actually got a policy in place where there are farmers like leasehold farmers on that leasehold land, and a lot of these are corporate, overseas, corporate entities buying state-owned leases, so state-owned land, and they are engaging in the carbon farming initiative in a situation where, so what we've got effectively, I don't want to complicate the matter, but what we've got is the taxpayer are paying for carbon sequestration on land that they already own.
Yeah,
they're paying for vegetation that they already own.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan. We're going to go to another caller, but we might call you back. What I want to make a point, though, is that what happened is the governing document of our country, the ultimate document, is the Constitution. The Constitution says you must pay compensation to anyone who loses the right to use their land. Now, the federal government got around that by going to the state governments because the state governments don't have to pay compensation. But this is a federal issue that was driven by the federal government at the time, John Howard's government, and no compensation was paid. It was deliberately avoided by that government by going around the Constitution. So much for protecting the people. Have we got Craig on the line?